Welcome everybody and welcome to today's webinar from Xceedium. I'm Patrick McBride. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Xceedium, and I'm going to just lay out a couple things here up front, and then we'll continue with today's webinar on bringing privileged passwords under control. First of all, you will notice most of you have you all have a question box. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to type in any questions into the box. We will save some time at the end to go through them. We've already got some questions about whether we'll be sharing the recording and the PowerPoint afterwards, which we will for anybody that registered. So we'll be able to turn that around sometime in the next couple of days. I have the distinct privilege of introducing two excellent speakers today. Our first speaker is Mark Bouchard. Mark is the co-founder and vice president of research at CyberEdge Group. And Mark's going to take us through some research that he's recently completed on the essential criteria for tools that tools need to have for managing privileged passwords in today's era. So looking very much forward to that. And then Ken Ammon, our own Chief Strategy Officer at Xceedium, is going to talk a little bit about what he's seeing with some of our customers and their experiences, and introduce our Xsuite product. We'll go for about 30 minutes with Mark. Do the handoff over to Ken. Ken's got about 15 minutes worth of material to cover, and then we'll save some time at the end for Q&A. So without further ado, let me pass the baton to Mark, and we'll get started.
All right, thank you, Patrick, and thanks to Xceedium for having me be a part of this event. You know, not only do I find privileged credential management to be an interesting topic, but it's also one, you know, at least in my opinion, that's greatly underappreciated relative to all the attention being paid to advanced malware and targeted attacks and the security challenges of the cloud and BYOD. So for the next 20 to 30 minutes, what I'm going to do is make the case as to why privileged credential management deserves at least as much attention as those other issues, and then give you a bit of a recipe for what I think constitutes a next generation solution in this area. And if we take a look at the next slide here, the first thing we need to do really is clarify what a privileged password is. And simply put, it's the password to a privileged account. So not your average domain account or a user account for webmail or internet banking, but the accounts that are used for system administration, for configuring your routers and switches, and pretty much for controlling who has access to what on your network. And a couple of more thoughts here, each of which I'm going to develop further as we go through the presentation. First, the term password really is too limited, it's too narrow, because there are other types of credentials that also serve as keys to your privileged accounts. I think thinking in terms of admin accounts is also too narrow, because there are other types of resources that also deserve a similar heightened level of attention. And then, what this attention is and what it should entail is really not just management of the credential itself, but also how it's being used. In other words, you really need to also think about managing the entire privileged user session. Let's put those, aside for now and turn to why managing privileged credentials is so important. And first, it might be cliche to say so, but these are quite literally the keys to the kingdom. The accounts we're talking about here that these keys are providing access to are ones that control your entire infrastructure, that control all of the apps that are running on top of it and all of the data that's stored within it. So if nothing else, managing and protecting these credentials and these accounts and access to them is going to be a good security practice from a risk management perspective. And really, making the case even stronger here, in my opinion, is the fact that most organizations exhibit some pretty poor practices in this area. Right? Things like having ridiculously weak passwords for their privileged accounts, or even if they have strong ones, maybe they're leaving them exposed, right? You see them on Post-it notes or spreadsheets, all the usual places, or maybe they're rarely rotated, or they're shared among multiple users, and that tends to expose them more. It also makes it more difficult to rotate them, and then there's also the challenges in that case around attribution, because now we don't have a one-to-one relationship. We have one password to many users. And then having no easy or quick way to revoke these credentials, I think that's another pretty big concern. Compliance, certainly another driving force here. There are all kinds of regulations and standards out there that are applicable to your organizations that have at least a handful of requirements, if not more, that pertain to privileged accounts. PCI, Data Security Standard, NIST Special Publication 800-53, probably two of the more notable examples I can point to. But really, what matters most at the end of the day here is that managing privileged credentials and access to the accounts that they're protecting there is absolutely central to avoiding security breaches. Right? And just think about these stats, all right? According to the most recent edition of the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, 76% of the breaches covered in that report could be traced back to stolen credentials. And then another 13% were the result of credential misuse by trusted insiders. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that's a real eye-opener. And what it's telling me is that before I spend another dime on some fancy new solution for detecting, advanced malware or for sifting through mountains of data to uncover a targeted attack, I might want to see what I can do to better manage and protect my organization's privileged credentials. On to the next slide. So, another point I think we need to consider here is that the scope, really, and therefore the risk level of this issue is probably greater than you might initially think. All right, so we're not just talking about your admin, your root, and your sys accounts for all your servers and your networking devices, but as you see here, there's some other dimensions that also require attention. So the impact of the hybrid cloud, application-to-application scenarios, and then the thousands of other keys that are typically going to be hidden throughout most organizations. And first here, the hybrid cloud implementations. This is where IT services and apps are going to utilize sort of some traditional infrastructure, they're going to utilize some virtualized infrastructure, and they're going to span, enterprise and cloud data centers. I think, everybody would agree, hybrid cloud implementations are inevitable, right? The cost advantages, the adaptability, the responsiveness of operating that way, those benefits are just too compelling for organizations to ignore. Along with those benefits, though, hybrid cloud's also going to bring some additional challenges for this topic of privileged credential management. Things like greater volume and scale, right? The ease of deploying virtual machines, that just means you're going to have more target systems with privileged accounts that need to be managed. Greater scope. Think about the virtualization and cloud management consoles. Very concentrated power, all right? This adds a new type of resource that is going to require access protection and privileged credential management protection. Greater dynamism, all right? New servers, new systems can be added on demand and in bulk. And then, a fourth point here is the potential for creating islands of identity, right? Each different cloud service is typically going to have its own identity store and its own identity infrastructure. And unfortunately, in most cases, that is separate from what your organization is already using. So we're going to have to, give some thought to that issue or that aspect of the problem as well. In terms of application to application or A to A, in that scenario, this is really where credentials used by one system or one app for gaining access to another system have either been hard-coded into the first application or they're made available to it in some kind of plain text configuration file. And a key point there is that neither of those mechanisms or approaches is particularly secure when you think about it. And then last but not least here is the issue that most organizations actually have thousands of other keys, for example, for SSH implementations, that they're not traditional phrase-oriented passwords, right? They're not that sort of password, but they still operate as an authentication credential to privileged accounts, and as a result, they still require management and protection if you want to reduce associated risks. And I'm going to get into all three of these topics a bit more as I proceed through the slides, but really the key point I want to drive home here is that privileged credential management is far more important and involves far more dimensions or complexity, if you will, than most organizations might think right off the bat. On to the next slide. So, we've talked a bit about why managing privileged credentials actually makes sense and, how you need to think about the scope of the problem. It's definitely bigger than a bread box. And now what we're going to do is turn to some of my recommendations of what to look for in a solution. And as you can see on this slide, I've organized what I believe are the 12 most important criteria into 3 categories: comprehensive controls, comprehensive coverage, and then cloud compatibility. And the way you really need to think about this approach is that, first, you need some set of capabilities or controls, if you will. And these really represent the heart of the solution. So what can it do to help you discover privileged accounts? And what can it then do to help you manage and protect and use all these credentials in a way that's going to minimize risk? Next, when we get to the middle column here, you need the capabilities from that first column to have wide applicability. In other words, you need support for all types of targets, or sometimes I use the word resources, as well as all kinds of credentials. So this is where we account for a lot of the scope-related items I mentioned earlier in terms of ensuring that we have support for cloud management consoles and the A-to-A use cases and all those other non-traditional passwords that are out there. And then last but not least here, you need the capabilities from that first column to be delivered in a way that is compatible with the ongoing evolution that we're seeing to cloud networks. All right, it's compatible with the adoption of the hybrid cloud environment or hybrid cloud configurations. And really, to be clear here, I don't think compatible is the best word. Really, what we want is a solution that is consistent with cloud principles and characteristics, right? That features the same sorts of agility and dynamic scalability and really the affinity for automation that's typical with today's cloud solutions. So being compatible or just working with the cloud, to me, that's really just table stakes. And what you really want is a solution that itself is going to be cloud-like in how it works. So now we're going to dig into each of these categories a little bit further. And comprehensive controls, part 1 on this next slide. So first up, in terms of the comprehensive controls, is automated or at least facilitated discovery. And I'll put it to you this way: if the only option you have is to manually bootstrap the solution, right, to manually find and enter all the accounts and credentials that you want to bring under management, you pretty much have a non-starter on your hands. All right, manual methods are simply too onerous, and they're also going to be fraught with errors and omissions to the point that it's not really going to do you much good. All right, and that's why you need to look for a solution that has multiple methods for discovering all your devices and your systems and your apps and your services and your accounts. And the mechanisms there may not be all that glamorous, but they're going to leverage well-known port associations. They're going to leverage your directory information or your management consoles or the APIs that are out there. And really, beyond these core discovery techniques, you also need to look at how easy it is to do things like bulk import from a text file. It sounds pretty rudimentary, but you want that capability. Or, for that matter, to manually make an entry through the management console. As I said, you're not going to want to do that for everything, but you're certainly going to want that capability as well. And then finally, I think to the extent that you can get a solution that does a good job of all this discovery and all this onboarding without requiring you to deploy agents on your target systems, that should be a goal too. All right. We need to face it, and we know this. Agents are messy, they're disruptive, and depending on how they actually work, they could actually introduce some new risks. So why go there if you don't have to? The second criteria, secure storage or vaulting, and here really what we're talking about is an encrypted and centralized vault. And really having this is key to eliminating the insecure storage alternatives, such as those post-it notes and spreadsheets and text files and wherever else your admins and privileged users are sprinkling these passwords. And really this is a pretty straightforward component of the solution, but there are still a number of features to look for to think about, starting with the type and the strength of the crypto algorithm that's used, and whether the implementation is FIPS certified. Whether there's support for all types of credentials, not just passwords. And we're going to get into that a little bit further later on. And then support for hardware security modules, right? HSMs as they're called. And that's important not for everyone, but certainly for high-profile organizations and use cases. Think financial systems or banks, because it gives them a way, a robust and secure way to separately store all of the crypto keys that are being used by the vault. And that's just, a higher level of security assurance, if you will. And one other feature here really to look for is the ability to prevent keys from being lifted, and this is the credentials as well as the crypto keys, when they're in use on a system, right? So it's just when they're in memory or when they're being accessed via, a crypto API or something like that. And that's really what I mean by extended protection. It looks like we've jumped ahead a little bit here. Thanks, Patrick. The last area really to get into here, the last third main bullet here, is automated policy enforcement. And this is what most people think about when they in fact think about privileged credential management. And it's a big part of what you need, along with the vaulting capability, to sort of programmatically prevent all those bad practices, such as having ridiculously weak passwords or posting passwords in the open. And what I'm talking about here is the ability to set and to enforce policies pertaining to things like password strength, or how often passwords need to be renewed or rotated, under normal circumstances, and then special circumstances as well, or different passwords or different credentials might have different rotation policies applied, and then things like limiting the time periods during which a credential can be used. And certainly here, the breadth of the policies that can be set, that's one thing to look at. But I think another potentially even more important consideration is the flexibility that you can apply these policies with. So you're going to want to look for a hierarchical policy model. You're going to want to look for the ability to group not only the policies, but group the targets, and to be able to apply the policies, again, in a very flexible way. And if everything's done right here, there's a nice sort of silver lining or a powerful byproduct, and that's the fact that your policies effectively become dynamic in the sense that a new target comes up, it gets added to a group. Well, as soon as it's added to that group, it also inherits the policies for that group. All right. We're going to move on now. We're still within that first category of comprehensive controls, but now we're looking at, I think it's the fourth item in the list. So if you're going to actually, centrally vault these credentials, then you also need to think about how they're going to be retrieved securely and used securely. And the first step in that process is one we're all familiar with. It's accurate authentication of whomever or whatever needs access to the credential. And again, here the ideal solution is going to allow you to leverage the existing identity infrastructure that you have by providing support for all the usual suspects: Active Directory, LDAP, Radius, and then a whole bunch of authentication options, whether it's two-factor tokens or certificates or SAML or composite authentication, and even PIV and CAT cards, so personal identity verification and common access cards, which are a pretty big deal these days for the U.S. federal agencies out there. Now, the second part, right, so that's the first part, authentication. The second part of the process really involves how the credentials are actually retrieved and then presented to the target system. And really what you're looking for here is a solution that's going to present those credentials to the target system on behalf of the user. So essentially acting as a proxy, all right, for lack of a better term. And that's going to require a bit more work on the part of the solution provider, because they're now going to have to support all these different access methods to interface with the target systems, things like RDP and SSH and web. But it's also a far more secure option than simple check-in and check-out alternatives. And I think some of the big advantages to highlight here of the proxy approach. Number one, credentials are never seen or distributed to the user. They're never seen by them or distributed to them. You can also, as a result of that, implement policies that make those passwords dramatically more complex, right? If the user never has to do anything with it, then you can make it 500 digits if you want. There's also no reliance on the user ensuring security of the credential, either on their endpoint or when they go to use it, so when it's in transit to the target system. And then, another big point here would be that because all of the access to the target systems happens via this authenticated, proxy or authenticated access to the proxy, it's now pretty much straightforward to solve the shared admin account problem, right? So now I have a way, even when the target system has shared admin account, to separate the activities of each individual user, because they're each individually having to sign into sort of this proxy. Last item, last big bullet in this category, criteria number 5, all about being able to keep up with changing conditions and requirements. All right, such as the transition that we see going on from old siloed IT infrastructure to the hybrid cloud environment. But another, big change here I think you want to be able to accommodate stems from what I would consider to be an inevitable realization that, credential management is really just a means to a greater end. It's a way station, if you will, on the road to a broader and equally important process, and that is actually controlling access to these accounts and to these high-risk resources. Not just managing the credentials, but controlling the access, and that's a big distinction. And once you realize this, then you're going to understand that what you really need is a full-featured, privileged identity management solution, as opposed to one that's just helping you manage and protect all the credentials. And when this day comes, I don't think it's an if, I think it's a when. You're going to want a way to seamlessly, ideally, make that transition without having to rip and place whatever you have in place already, and without having to purchase and integrate yet another product. And really, that's what I'm talking about here, is finding a solution that includes all the other stuff you're probably going to want some point down the road. So granular role-based access control, real-time monitoring of privileged user sessions, real-time enforcement of what commands users can issue, full session recording and playback, and so forth. And I see that we've moved ahead again. Let's move ahead then. So we're breaking now into the coverage category, the middle slice from that chart way back there. And first up here is support for what I'll call the obvious and semi-obvious targets in your environment. And these include all the traditional things, right? Windows and Linux boxes, perhaps even mainframes, your service accounts for all your important apps, all your service accounts for your routers and your switches and your key networking devices, the telnet and SSH-based systems that you use to access many of these devices, and a couple of hundred other things probably as well. The less obvious group here is what I'm calling modern targets, and it's a pretty small step, I think, to realize that virtualized systems also need to be covered, right? So whether it's a virtualized app or a virtualized server, whatever. But beyond those, you've got the consoles that you use to manage all of your virtualized infrastructure and your cloud computing solutions. And think about it, right? These are very powerful resources where you can literally spin up or even down entire swaths of your infrastructure with just a couple of mouse clicks. So, certainly that's at least as important than the admin account for a core router or, a business critical app, if not far more important. And really, if you weren't convinced, I think before, of the need to do more than just credential management, you should be now, because tightly controlling who does what within these consoles should be an imperative for most organizations. And you're going to want to do that across all the consoles without having to maintain completely separate sets of policies and without having to work with each console independently. So that's another thing to look for there, is a solution that's going to allow you to span all of those and also do it in a way that masks some of the complexity and underlying variability. If we move on now to the hidden targets, they aren't really hidden anymore because we've kind of already talked about them a little bit. But for app to app, the main point here is that humans aren't the only users of your privileged credentials, right? So for most organizations, there are all these systems that are configured to automatically access sensitive resources, such as other applications and databases. And as I mentioned, the mechanisms there aren't typically very secure. And not only that, they kind of complicate the process of trying to manage the credentials in terms of rotating them, and refreshing them periodically in accordance with best practices. And really, so a better approach here would be to use a solution that allows you in some way to treat these privileged credentials just like all your other credentials, right? So you want to be able to centrally vault them, automatically enforce policies, and then make auditing the use of the credentials, pretty simple and straightforward. And one way of doing this, perhaps, is by providing developers with a means to inject some code down in their app that gives that privileged app everything it needs to retrieve the credential at the time of use, right, versus being hard-coded in. And then also, ideally, protecting it, while it's in memory on the system. The second hidden target, actually, now that I think about it, target is not the right word here, but the point of still needing coverage is still true. And what I'm getting at is the fact that many types of keys, again, I mentioned this already, in addition to supporting cryptographic operations, also serve as tokens to confirm identity. So even though they're not passwords in the traditional sense, they still operate like passwords and are still subject to the same sorts of risks. Not only that, they're typically, embedded or used in a way that's going to shield their complexity. So that makes them more likely to be orphaned, more likely to proliferate over time because they're kind of transparent to everybody. But all of these reasons is why it makes sense to apply many of the same controls that we're using for, our other privileged passwords to these keys, these other types of credentials as well. And in fact, if you do a quick Google search, you might find that there's an IETF draft specification out there, and it's got a lot of content around this topic. But in particular, what I want to highlight is it talks about best practices for mitigating threats against these keys, right? Such as moving the keys to protected locations, like a vault, or rotating the keys on a regular basis so that in the event that they are exposed, eventually they become worthless, or enforcing restrictions for the source of the key or who's using the key, or enforcing command restrictions for who's using the key. And really what all this means is that you really need to be looking for a solution that also accounts for these alternate credential types, things like the SSH keys or PEM encoded keys that are used for Amazon Web Services, again, so that they get centrally vaulted, so that they are automatically rotated and controlled, and so that when they're retrieved and presented, it's done in a secure way, in a way that minimizes the potential for their theft and for their exposure. And with that, we'll move on to the third main category, for and of the cloud. And in the hybrid cloud era, I think another major gating factor for the success of any solution is how well it fits in, all right? And that's not only physically how it fits in, but also in terms of how it aligns with cloud networking needs and capabilities. And the first thing to look for here is flexible delivery options, right? You should have the option to deploy this privileged credential management solution any way you want. So whether it's an on-premises hardened appliance, or on-premises or in the cloud virtual appliance, or maybe it's just a cloud service from a SaaS or infrastructure service provider. And really more than that would be the ability to mix and match, and to have deployments where you use multiple of these options and everything just works seamlessly together. Next would be cloud aligned features. And what you see here are just a couple of examples of things I could think of. I'm sure others are going to emerge over time, but auto discovery and protection, those speak to the need to have identification in real time of new cloud-based systems that pop up, new virtualized systems that pop up, and then for these systems to automatically be subject to whatever set of policies are appropriate whenever and wherever they do show up. Identity federation, that's all about eliminating the islands of identity that I talked about earlier, and that's done by having really close or tight integration, typically with the cloud management platform, in a way that allows the organization to actually reuse all of its existing identity infrastructure instead of having to always use whatever the cloud solution is providing. And then enabling automation here, that's all about having an open and very well documented API, so that you can do programmatic access by orchestration systems and other types of management systems, and that there are multiple touch points within the credential management solution. And you may not be interested in that capability right now, but with the evolution that we're seeing to things like software-defined data centers, it's just a matter of time. You're going to need it. And then last but not least here, the idea of having cloud-aligned architecture. Instead of working well within the hybrid cloud environment, this is really all about acting like a full-fledged citizen of the cloud environment, right? And that's done by exhibiting cloud-like characteristics. For example, by having elastic scalability and being inherently reliable. And I think, it's pretty obvious here that privileged credential management is a critical service for your infrastructure, right? If it's not up and running and if it's not performing adequately, then business operations will be impacted. And that's even more true when you start to think about the A-to-A use cases. And all I'm saying here is that the way you address that need for reliability and availability and high performance should be cloud-like, right? Where more scale can be added without the need to rip and replace a bunch of hardware. And ideally where high availability just comes along as a byproduct of having a clusterable solution. And last point here, though, it's important. These are just examples, and ultimately, I think you're going to want to give some more thought to all the ways you want your solution to be more than just cloud compatible, but actually cloud-like. And in terms of bottom lines, I'll make this quick so we can get on to Ken. Managing and protecting privileged credentials, it's always been important. It's also always been somewhat of a challenge, and as a result has sometimes been left on the back burner. And a big part of that's been the diversity of targets and the account types that need to be supported. And the hybrid cloud environment that we're headed toward, or some of us are already in, it only serves to raise the bar even further, as it introduces all of this, dynamic scaling and all of these extremely powerful management consoles. So what today's organizations need then to address this situation, as we've discussed, is a solution that's going to simultaneously provide them with comprehensive controls and comprehensive coverage while being cloud compatible and cloud-like in terms of its delivery options and its features and its architecture. And if you do all of that, if you're lucky enough to find that solution and implement it, some of the benefits, clearly you're going to have reduced IT risk, you're going to have improved operational efficiency, and then you're also going to have a very good measure of investment protection because you're going to have support for traditional infrastructure and virtualized infrastructure and for the hybrid cloud. And with that, I'm going to take a breath and turn it over to Ken.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's an excellent presentation. And my name is Ken Ammon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Xceedium. And I'd like to take a moment and thank everyone this afternoon for participating in the webinar. I'll be introducing you to Xsuite, which is Xceedium's privileged identity and access control platform. And in particular, I'll be trying to make some connectivity here between what Mark covered, in many cases I view as best practice, and high-level connect the dots here on our end on how Xsuite delivers next-generation privileged password management. Next slide. So I think anyone who's spent any time in the security field, they probably have found that there's two issues that you've heard about for years. One is passwords, and they've always been a challenge. I think they're not going anywhere anytime soon, even though the field has become more complicated with additional implementations for password-like utility. But the other piece of the equation, as far as risk management goes, tends to come down to people. And if you look at many of the most commonly exploited methods for gaining access, many of them are spear phishing. And on the other hand, you have these issues with credential theft. And particularly in the spear phishing area, but as well in the credential theft area, it really is a matter of managing the people if you're going to better manage your risk. And so how do you go about taking people out of the loop in many of these areas where they introduce risk? So first, let's talk about a little bit of password complexity. Entropy, or password entropy, is basically a way to measure the strength of a password. And length, complexity, and duration before change all feed into getting a greater level of entropy out of your passwords. People left to their own devices tend to use memorable passwords, not necessarily very long passwords, and not necessarily taking advantage of password entropy from the end system. And this opens you up to a number of ways that attacks are performed, both brute force and dictionary. And dictionary are faster methods for attack, and the more the humans are selecting the passwords, the higher the probability that a dictionary attack is going to work. And with the advent of cloud computing, you have more and more capacity out there to run these sort of attacks in a high-scale model for a low price point. So in removing people from the loop here, what you're trying to do is take advantage as much as possible of introducing automation and centralizing management to manage these risks. And what Xsuite's platform has been designed to do is focus on those areas. Any place possible that we can handle a management process and ensure that it happens not only is very helpful for meeting audit and highly regulated industry requirements for their security practice, but it results in clear security advantage at the end of the day. And in many cases, will also give more time back to the folks that otherwise have to support these systems or actually participate within them, where you're doing multiple logins to multiple systems. So the approach that we've taken at Xceedium here is to basically tokenize the password and turn that into a machine-to-machine relationship. And we'd like to better arm privileged users with a login that meets a higher degree of assurance. In many cases, folks are moving towards smart cards and, in the back end, integrated solutions with HSMs. But passwords, I think we can all agree, aren't going to disappear tomorrow. What we'd like to do is recommend customers remove the human from that process, allow them to single sign-on through a higher assurance credential, and basically tokenize the password process on the back end to take the maximum advantage of entropy for the end system and take a maximum advantage of rotation. And the advantage said for is clear in risk management, but also I think on compliance, it becomes much easier in a centralized fashion to demonstrate to an auditor that you've been able to manage your risk appropriately. Next slide. So the issue of credential strength is touched on in entropy, but you know, with the and Mark touched on this in his presentation, you have various methods for accessing systems, particular for privileged users, and in cloud computing, many cases for infrastructure as a service. As you provision platforms, you're going to have various methods at your disposal for gaining that privileged access. And more you see some version of certificate-based key exchange, and that may be stored in a file such as a PEM file, which you pass to the end system to gain access. And in many cases, these files can be shared across various administrators so that they can get access. Introduces yet another challenge with humans in the play here, which is attribution. And so gaining control of an emerging space, which is really a layer on top of what isn't going to be going anywhere anytime soon in your traditional infrastructure of passwords, and being able to also handle both compliance and risk management challenges for attribution are key foundations for how we've designed our platform. And these are the areas we get a lot of positive response back from customers when they feel a solution is that they not only have better managed their risk, they've decreased the complexity for dealing with compliance and audit reporting, but they've also found in many cases ways to create efficiencies in the organization. And you know, those efficiencies result in folks being able to tackle other issues as opposed to some of this legacy challenge that in many cases solutions are available, such as our platform, to manage. Next slide. So in looking across a comprehensive set of controls along with cloud compatibility, I think that you have to be able to design a solution that is enterprise grade, and by enterprise grade, it's going to be able to manage traditional infrastructure, credentials, and passwords, virtualized infrastructure, as well as their consoles for access, cloud infrastructure, both private, public, community, and hybrid, and also application to application, which Mark touched on. Now there's various flavors inside of that world, particularly around cloud. And so you want to be able to look for a solution that is going to provide a single platform for managing across the various repositories for these credentials. Otherwise, you will end up with these stranded islands of management systems. You'll increase the difficulty for federating, and I think you'll increase the amount of time that you're going to spend in trying to manage that solution. The one place I wanted to touch on as well, because this is an emerging area, which is API access or system management API access. And much like app-to-app communication where you have passwords that have been hard-coded into programs, you're also now finding that you have to hard-code certain credentials into API calls to get the cloud infrastructure to respond appropriately. So our approach has been to continue to develop and drive that solution around APIs, but we have a rich set of capabilities around traditional virtualized and cloud infrastructures to provide an out-of-the-box solution that will meet many of those end system issues. And I'll get into a diagram of how we do that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So the Xsuite platform architecture is the core of our next generation approach. And it's not only providing this integrated password/credential management approach, but it is also key in supporting access control. And I think that's ultimately you're getting through identification and authentication through a password and an ID. But that quickly turns into a challenge for access control. So I do think that integrating those two worlds is becoming increasingly important. And there are certainly emerging solutions around issues like attributes that you'll have to be able to introduce into this process. So we've taken an approach that allows us to vault and secure the environment where the credentials are managed and provide that assurance all the way up to the highest government standards where you have FIPS 140-2 level 3, which is inclusive of physical tamper resistance. And really treat those credentials as important as they should be, because they are, as Mark mentioned, the keys to the castle. But by centralizing and controlling and proxying the provisioning to the end solution, we now introduce the capability to not only support this broad set of back-end solutions such as traditional, virtualized, and cloud, expanded now to APIs, but we've also been able to take advantage of emerging capability around things like attributes. So where you may have data that's important for defining roles and access inside of LDAP or Active Directory, our platform can digest that information and turn those attributes into actionable policy after the authentication has been made. The other area we see, I think, significant growth around is this issue of wanting to strengthen the identity. We're talking about passwords here, but in many cases, you may have the identity as root and then a password or a PEM-encoded file that goes with that login, and you're not getting a whole lot of value out of root. You can have 70 folks logged in at one time as root, other than IP addresses, which can be dynamic or maybe even remote access, which makes it more difficult. You can't get to that level of attribution. So we're finding also there's an emerging market around supporting personal identification verification built into multi-factor authentication, in many cases extending to biometrics. And you provide that on the front end, you can do a far better assignment of role and fine-grained privileges, but you can also take advantage of a single multi-factor authentication device in the user's hands, and once again, secure and automate and take maximum advantage of what is available for password use and management on the back end. Next slide, please. So, as I stated earlier, Xceedium operates in a proxying mode. So, typically in an environment, you might be going directly to the endpoint to log in. And this can be very difficult, by the way, with privileged users and being able to detect when a credential has been compromised. A user coming from their desktop and coming across a network that may be flat and connecting directly to a server is part of the everyday job, potentially, for an administrator. By integrating our Xsuite platform, we now bring a proxying capability. What that does is that ensures all of that access that's privileged, whether that's RDP, secure shell, web-based, or terminal-based, will be coming from a single place, and that's the Xsuite platform. That's where the vaulting and the password management is taking place. This provides the ability to now grant that access across the structure no matter where it may be. So we are vaulting the credentials, we're centralizing that authentication, and we bring the value of now being able to federate that privileged identity across various segments. And once again, this has been very helpful to customers where they might be dealing with an organization that might have multiple Active Directory or LDAP directories, and that's how they've been granting their privileged access. So federating that, taking control of those passwords, and delivering the solution on a platform that'll span from a hardware appliance to a hardened virtual appliance to an Amazon AMI, and providing the flexibility that you can combine these devices based upon the environment and where you want to execute on the solution. So the keys here really are that you get full attribution for that end user. You can deploy a single sign-on for these privileged users, and you can maximize that entropy and remove that risk of the human being involved while maintaining those back-end password-enabled systems. Next slide, please. So through this slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about how Xceedium layers in these controls. So first thing we do on a deployment is we create these plugins to the back-end platforms to now take control of the passwords themselves. So we'll take both the role and the password in. And once we have those points defined, we can then deploy what the user selects as their policy for that end platform. And you can do anywhere from single-use passwords, so you rotate them immediately after use, to every 30 days or 60 days. So you can align that automated password management capability along with the risk of the end system and the degree that you want to protect that end data point. But the key here is that we're capable of integrating with these other higher degree solutions. So once you've made this integration for your legacy password management systems, you can adopt a much easier to manage single device for these users that will allow them to access whatever the platform is that we are protecting. And the added value here that you're getting from this is the ability in a proxy mode to monitor and prevent unauthorized access and unauthorized commands. And this is really where you get into the value of being more proactive than just reactive. So for an account that has properly logged in, unlike a VPN where you might have access to whatever is on that segment of the network, when you log in with a strong credential through an Xsuite platform, you're only presented with the devices that you're approved to have access to. So going a long way to enforce this least privilege approach. And by proxying that solution, there's another layer that we find is as much security value as operational value, which is monitoring the entire session and recording that session. So we combine a logging approach for violations along with the ability ability to do full recording of sessions and playback of those sessions. And if policies are violated, the user can be suspended or locked out until that issue has been reviewed. Key here, in particular with the highly publicized issues of system admins gaining access and potentially taking that data and leaking it out afterwards. Being able to provide that attribution and do a search over time and say, I'd like to make sure I can gain every record of this particular admin and everything they've done across wherever the system may be for the past 3 years, and running a simple search, being able to get that data at a high level from a SIM platform or a log management platform, and then being able to get full-on recording replay of every single session. It's one of those things that you really are very thankful that it exists post a loss, and it's almost impossible to get this data if you don't have a solution such as Xsuite in place prior to the loss. So that's a summary of high-level overview of how Xsuite and Xceedium deploys and helps manage and reduce that risk around password management, and more importantly, as you move toward that integrated password, credential management, and access control for your enterprise, wherever that may take you, virtualized, cloud, or some version of hybrid, which is our view. Most of the enterprise market will end up in some version of hybrid access. So with that, I think we're going to open it up to questions, and I'll pass it back to Patrick to handle that.
Thanks, Ken, and my apologies for advancing Mark a little bit quickly on some of those slides. Hey, so we've got a set of questions here I'll throw out, and the first one's kind of a technical one in nature, and I think there was maybe some confusion as we went through it. And the question's this: with regard to cloud, how is it different? What we're doing from the Amazon Web Service IAM policies and that platform. Maybe Ken, I'll have you take a stab at that.
Our approach at Xceedium is to take maximum advantage of what the end platform has to provide, and in password management, we're doing that by not trying to rewrite the end system's password management capability. We're taking maximum advantage of the entropy that's afforded there. So there's two things that we're doing in a cloud environment such as Amazon. One is we can create an abstraction layer for that IAM identity and credential necessary for that login. And where this becomes important is increasingly you have, as a customer, support teams that are involved in either managing, monitoring, or developing in that cloud environment. And when you grant them the actual credentials, you run into circumstances that can be difficult when contractors are coming or going to manage that access. So we've been able to provide an abstraction layer, and we will take advantage of that back-end IAM capability in Amazon, but the credentials that you're using to log in to the management console or the credentials you're using within the APIs are not the actual credentials being used behind the scenes. We're vaulting and managing those. In many cases, we can be doing that process either in the Amazon cloud or within your facility. So we have more and more of our customers that want to take advantage of their identification and authentication system or higher level credentials such as multi-factor personal identification verification cards. And we can, on their premise, now control that access to the cloud. So if somebody who's doing system management is at home and they would like to be able to access that cloud, they can't just punch directly into Amazon from home and do what they're going to do. They would have to come through Xsuite, and either Xsuite would proxy the API calls or proxy the web-based interface, and your interaction would then be controlled, contained, monitored, and audited, which can be difficult to do on an enterprise level if you are putting all of that into the end system. Hope that answers the question.
Yep. So there's a little bit of a related, technical question. I might toss this one to Mark too, kind of in the overarching discussion is the difference between this and kind of just a VPN, sort of exercise in terms of access control. I know we focused on password management, but there was some question as to how that would be different, or can you accomplish what you need to do just with a VPN?
Yeah, I would suggest that it's going to be extremely challenging to do what you need to do with just a VPN. Just off the top of my head, things like the full session recording and playback is not a feature that exists with any VPN today. And being able to interface with all types of target systems, right? Ken mentioned this. I think I mentioned it too. You guys have built into your solution, secure shell, web, terminal services. Certainly you can get to some of that stuff via VPN, but I don't know if it's all covered as seamlessly as the way you guys have it. I'd be interested in Ken's additional thoughts there too, because I think there's a lot of functionality. VPN gives you straight up access, but not certainly the breadth of control and monitoring that I think you're going to get with the Xsuite.
Yeah, just to follow up on Mark's comments there, you may or may not have heard of this term called zero trust, but it really aligns very closely with what's been around in computer science and security for quite some time, which is least privilege. And that is, it's much easier to only grant the access that someone needs and secure it than grant access and then try to deny what might be a bad thing, right? And if you run the math on either side, it's mathematically much more complicated and difficult to try to stop bad things as opposed to just grant what's authorized. And so I think if you look at VPNs, in many cases, they're granting access to infrastructure. And now it's up to each endpoint to protect itself and to know that you should only connect in a particular fashion. What our platform does is it runs through identification and authentication, and you are granted access only to the specific end device and the specific protocol to communicate to that end device. And if it's one device and one protocol, that's all you have access to, not a network or LAN segment. And you're never granted access to any of that internal IP space. And that's both containing and controlling that access and ensuring that you can't leapfrog from the left or right from that access point. So I think that's a key difference here in evolving around least privilege.
So actually two questions very related, so I'll throw them. Ken, I'll throw these to you. So specifically for Xsuite, and you probably have to paraphrase this one, what platforms does it support? And by that I think we're talking targets. And then there was a related question on what directories. We've talked about some of the directories, but which do we integrate with?
So, there's a high-level answer to that, and then there's a more detailed answer. I think if you go operating system by operating system, we've been doing this for quite some time, so we have a breadth of connectivity capability to those end operating systems. The key there is really understanding what that entropy availability is for that end system. And operating system X or web-based application Y may take very different sets of character combinations for passwords. So we can support that capability, and we have many of those most widely used industry connectors built in, including things like mainframe. So at a high level, traditional infrastructure, things like VMware, console access, and cloud infrastructure such as Amazon we're fully integrated in support of. And that's both the end target system as well as the management console. I know there was a second part of the question there, Patrick.
Directory.
Yes, so in federating across directories, we mostly run into a combination of Active Directory for Microsoft and LDAP, but as we've expanded into more sort of SaaS-oriented cloud players such as Microsoft Office 365 Online, the requirement we've had to adopt there is being able to support things like ADFS on the back end and being able to also handle SAML 2.0 assertions. So as a proxy, there's some unique value that we have in being able to do that with that federation. But in many cases where you're trying to consume those attributes, but you don't want to create connectivity from a trust perspective across those Active Directory islands, Xceedium is an excellent platform to do that for your privileged use accounts.
Excellent. Well, and I've got, I think, one or two more very specific questions that I think we need a little bit more context for. So we'll reach out to those individuals directly and answer them. I have one that I can actually handle today, which was will we get copies of the presentation? And I think I started off there. We'll get you copies of the recorded webinar out and a copy, PDF versions of the PowerPoints too. I know some folks have expressed the fact that they'd like to share this with some of the folks in their organization. So with that, I think we'll wrap up here. I want to thank Mark for an excellent presentation and a very in-depth coverage of the topic. And Ken for really giving us some perspective about how that might look at an organization and how Xsuite fits in. I think we got really 360 degrees all the way around this topic. Very happy. I didn't mention up front, but we've got a very international set of folks on the phone. So we've got folks from all around the world, which is, I think, fairly typical for our webinars. So we will bid everybody good morning, good evening, depending on where you're at, and we will hopefully see you on another Xceedium webinar coming up shortly. Take care. Have a fantastic day.